Oh, we're live. We're live. It's working now. Whew. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We apologize for the delay. There were technical issues, but we are here and we are so excited to be here. I want to first introduce myself. My name is Emma Scheinbaum. I am the Communications and Development Coordinator at the Department of History here at Columbia. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to Saida.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Saida Islam, and I'm the Faculty Affairs Coordinator here at the History Department. This is our fourth panel in conversation with historians. Today, we're going to discuss immigration and activism and how scholarship and activism go hand in hand. We have a lot of amazing faculty and students here at Columbia that are not only making a difference within academia through their teaching and a lot of our students who are writing on immigration and their scholarship, but also they're doing very important work on the grounds and at a grassroots level. And for those of you who joined us for our previous panel on immigration history, this is a follow-up to that. And now we want to highlight the activism aspect of immigration and why it's so important to not only stay up to date with immigration policies and everything that's going on around us, but also how you all can be a part of it, right? Sometimes we feel overwhelmed and aren't sure how we can make a difference. And so today we are going to hear from specialists and scholars on immigration history and how they are making a difference through their classroom, in their classrooms, but also from, activists who are students at Columbia and also doing work on the grounds, as I mentioned. And so we're very excited. Thank you again for joining us. And I will turn it over to Emma to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Saida, and thank you all for being here. We have with us today Professor Nara Milanch. She is a professor of history at Barnard College and Columbia University, where she specializes in modern Latin American history, with particular interest in the history of family, childhood, reproduction, law, and social inequality. In recent years, she has taught a course, Seeking Asylum, History, Politics, and the Search for Justice at the US-Mexico border, and served as a translator at the country's largest ICE detention facility in Dilley, Texas. We also have Ivón Padilla-Rodríguez as a US History PhD candidate in the History Department. She is completing a dissertation on the 20th century history of Latinx child migration to the US. Specifically, she addresses the history of undocumented child labor trafficking, the school to deportation pipeline, and immigrant child detention. Outside of the academy, she has conducted research on the migration of children, women, and families for the federal government and nonprofits in the US and Mexico. Ana Barrios is a Guatemalan immigrant currently studying political science and human rights at Columbia University. She is also the co-director and co-founder of Students for Sanctuary, a student group that takes part in the fight towards immigrant justice. Andres Jiminez is the Anti-Detention and Bond Fund Coordinator for New Sanctuary Coalition. He was born and raised in Brooklyn by his parents, who are Paraguayan immigrants, and was a first-generation college graduate. Deirdre Sinnott is a writer and activist. She met Shakoure while he was incarcerated and made a film about a situation called 23 Reasons Why 23 Years is Enough. You can find the links to that video on YouTube in the webinar, and I'll be posting them shortly on the live streaming platforms. We also have with us today Meryl Ranzer, excuse me, who is a fashion designer, activist, and campaign and media coordinator at the New Sanctuary Coalition. Thank you all again for being here. We also want to say thank you to our office assistants, Julia and Bethany, who are here today to help. And Julia played a huge part in making this panel today happen. So thank you. And I'm gonna just dive into the conversation. Anyway, this is pretty informal, so you all can just jump in when you want to talk, when there's there's an opportunity to talk. And this first question, though, is more for Professor Milanch, or Nara, and Ivón. What can we expect to change in this shift from the Trump administration to Biden? What will not change? And why is it important to stay mobilized?
So maybe I'll just start. And I just want to thank, first of all, Emma and Saida for organizing this panel. It is an exciting moment, a promising moment perhaps, but one in which we really need to stay informed and mobilized. And so I really appreciate this platform to have this conversation, and also to have a conversation not just within the history department or with people on campus, but outside of campus, and thinking about the ways that we can all collaborate and think through common issues together. So here we are at this moment after the election, sort of the election that will never end. And I think this question about what's going to change in immigration policy and what's not going to change is one that is very much on people's minds. For me personally, my thinking on this is that in the first place, that electing Trump out of office was the absolutely necessary, most urgent, critical first step, but it is also entirely insufficient, right? And extremely partial as an initial step away from this moment where we are right now. So on the one hand, I think there are many things that we can expect will change quickly. One of the things we learned about Donald Trump in the last 4 years is that he turns out not to actually be a particularly good deal maker after all, right? So almost all of his immigration changes came through executive orders and administrative rules as opposed to legislation. And so those things are relatively easy to undo. The Muslim ban, attacks on DACA, attacks on the asylum system, et cetera. But I think we also need to be very clear about the limitations of this administration. And we need to realize that the reason that Trump was such, and has been, I'm already talking about him in the past tense, is such an effective xenophobe, is because he relied on pre-existing structures and practices and discourses, right? He didn't invent immigration detention. He didn't invent xenophobia. He didn't invent family separation. These are all things that existed before Trump was delivered to us. They existed, of course, under Obama, the so-called deporter-in-chief. So Trump really turbocharged weapons that were handed to him by other people. And we need to be aware of that, right? That when Trump leaves, this is not the end of the story. And in particular, I think we need to be very cautious about what Biden brings for us, given that he, of course, was part of the administration before Trump, which has been so criticized by immigration activists, rightly. Ivón.
I also really want to thank Emma and Saida for organizing and facilitating this panel. I feel really honored to be a part of it. And I also agree with Nara in that it's really important to have these conversations, not only among scholars, but also among people in the public. I think it's important to engage practitioners and to bring in also the voices of immigrants who live with the consequences of immigration policies every single day in ways that US citizens don't. I agree with a lot of what Nara said. I think it's extremely important to remain alert and mobilized during the upcoming Biden administration for a number of reasons. I'm going to try to limit them to like what I see as being some of the most important policies that we might have to be really vigilant about when they come to children and families in particular, not only because they're my particular place of expertise, but also because as a historian, I've seen how both liberal or democratic administrations have violated the rights of children, have detained children, have separated families in ways that sometimes are actually not all that distinct from some of the policies and practices that have been pursued by more conservative and Republican administrations. First of all, I see a lot of clamoring for a return to the status quo. Maybe that's just some of the like particular like worlds and conversations that I'm a part of, but I see a lot of Americans who claim that they just want to return to normalcy. And while our present circumstances are unbearable in a lot of ways, and I completely sympathize and empathize with that, what I often see is missing in the debate is a critical examination of what the Obama era status quo means for immigrant children and families in particular. The Obama-Biden administration is responsible, like Nara mentioned, for a historic number of deportations. I have uncles myself who were deported during the Obama administration. They're also responsible for the construction of the family detention infrastructure. Again, echoing what Nara said, President Trump might be really brazen, and for like a white nationalist like him, his rhetoric is scary and egregious, but he wasn't acting in isolation. He didn't invent a lot of these policies. In fact, he was using an infrastructure that he inherited, that he didn't invent. I also want to emphasize that deportation is also family separation, which is rarely recognized in popular debates over immigration. It's not only the deliberate separation of families, which in and of itself is traumatic, egregious, a crime against humanity, but deportation, policing in the interior of the nation, that also can be tantamount to family separation. There are, I think, a lot of questions too that the incoming Biden administration raises when it comes to the promises that they've made, because they have, for the President-elect Biden has said that, for example, he's going to restore asylum and the Remain in Mexico program, and that surely will alter a lot of lives. But there are also a lot of questions about whether or not those asylum seekers will be allowed the opportunity to pursue their cases in freedom in the United States. So there are also very specific questions about asylum seeking children and families who might be stuck in these squalid camps on the other side of the border, to what extent they're going to be addressed in the incoming administration. There's also a CDC order that has expelled thousands of children at the border under the guise of like public health concerns. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been commentary on whether or not that and how exactly that will be addressed. So while some things are bound to change, other things I'm very wary of, in part because I see the danger of letting our guard down in the face of an administration that claims to honor certain humanitarian principles, but has in fact also created an infrastructure with which to violate rights. I'm sure others have other thoughts. Yeah.
One of the follow-up, thank you, Nara and Ivón. One of the follow-up questions that we had is sort of what both of you have already answered, but the question is just talking about the implications of the different administrations and varying forms of xenophobia that can take, especially with regard to minors. Does anyone else want to add to that? Or Ivón and Nara, if you guys have anything else you guys want to say, we sort of want to open this question to everyone. I guess something more specific would be, as Ivón mentioned, that the Trump administration did receive a lot of heat for putting children in, cages and deportations, but it was also happening during the Obama administration. How can we, as educators, organizers, or even just everyday people, just hold our administration accountable for this and not be blinded by the dual party system and showing alliance to, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, but really seeing like the realities that are happening in between, both parties and in respect to immigration. With a Biden administration coming in, like how can we as a people hold them accountable?
Just listening to the discussion, I just wanted to add a thing that just today I was doing some research about an enslaved man who had been looking for his family after the Civil War. And I was also looking at something else that was about the clearing of Mississippi from the Native nations that were there, pushed west across Mississippi. And we have a long history of separating children from their parents and separating families and tearing them apart. And even more recent with Native people who had gone through a thing where children were taken and put into certain schools. So I think there's a a lot of parallels to be drawn in terms of the analysis of what's going on. It's not new for the United States to be doing this.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to add anything? Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. So, I was just going to briefly add, we at New Sanctuary are working right now with a family from Honduras, and it's a mother and her children. One of her children is ill, and if they deport the family back to Honduras, he cannot get care there. And we also know what's happening in Honduras right now because of COVID and because of the 2 hurricanes. And she was given a stay of deportation, but we just recently heard that she's been asked to come back and check in with a plane ticket in December. We have a date. And I just want to bring that up because, you know, as was said, like, family separation continues. It's, it's not just happening at the border. And ICE is choosing to do this. They do not have to do this. They want to do this. And we wonder, as activists and advocates right now, if they are with intention getting crueler for the next 2 months. So for the next 2 months, we have to really push harder, and then we will continue to push, once Biden takes the office. But these next 2 months seem quite dangerous. Thanks.
Definitely. And as thank you for that. And we want to learn more about New Sanctuary Coalition. We want to hear about, like, how did it start and why did it start? And I suppose, like, as we're seeing things get, like, as you said, crueler, we're also seeing the community come together now, like, more visibly than ever. And I mean, I know that gives me hope, but how can anyone really anywhere in the country get involved in community, I suppose? And that's for Andres or Meryl or anyone associated with New Sanctuary Coalition.
Yeah, so I just piggyback off of what everyone said. One of our biggest fears, right, with this new coming administration is since he's linked, or he was working with the Obama presidency and that whole attachment with hope. We were afraid of now that the new president-elect coming into office, people will say, well, okay, well, now things are getting back to normal and it won't be as bad. And that's how ICE became so effective in destroying our community. And it was also so easy for the community to get involved and engage, because it was so easy to hate Trump for how he ran how he ran his campaign to become president. And personally, that's how I got involved. I know some other staff members at New Sanctuary now had gotten involved because of that. So we always want to continue to engage the students. Like Anna, Trisha, they were interns with New Sanctuary Coalition, and we're so happy that they were able to found Students for Sanctuary and continue to help us. And just to say that you don't have to have a specific training or you don't have to be a certain type of way to be an advocate. In our own personal lives, we're advocates. You listen to the community. For example, if you're a family of immigrants, personally, my parents didn't know English, so I had to translate for them. I had to, advocate for them in every circumstance of their life. Whenever we went to the DMV, when we went to the grocery store, so that everyone has an advocate in themselves. It's just a matter of, just listening to the people that are around you who are asking for help. And that's what you're able to do with New Sanctuary. Now because of COVID, everything is virtual. So we have the Pro Se Clinic that's virtual. We have community meeting every Thursday that's virtual. We have the Jericho Walk that's virtual as well. And it's all about just listening to the needs of the community, getting together, creating campaigns like the campaigns that we have for Shakoure, who's currently in detention, the campaign that we're creating for the other friend that Meryl had mentioned as well. And it's just listening, getting together in community, strategizing together with everyone. everyone plays a part. You know, you have the professors, you have the PhD candidates who have that history and that knowledge, and they're able to track patterns. And you have advocates like ourselves. You have students that are able to mobilize on the ground, signing petitions, shining the light on issues that ICE wants to put into the darkness. So yeah, those are just a few ways that you can get involved. New Sanctuary has many programs. We have the accompaniment program, the anti-detention program, the bond fund. We have the Pro Se Clinic. So there are many different ways. I may be missing a few different ways because I'm starting to go on and on, but yeah, we're all here. I'm expecting for the fight to get harder, not with this new administration, but we welcome everyone with open arms.
And can I just add that Deirdre is here to talk about Shakoure's campaign specifically, because what we're hoping by the end of this call is that we get everyone who is out there listening enrolled in fighting for Shakoure, and then the other campaign for Maria that I mentioned. We don't have all of that together yet, but if you join, you know, if we'll add the link, or I guess you'll be sending out some information, we can share, because that one's pretty, we need for Maria, we need that fight to happen like yesterday. But maybe Deirdre, if it's okay for me to ask Deirdre to share about Shakoure. Thanks.
Yeah, I met Shakoure in Otisville Correctional Facility in upstate New York. A friend of mine had asked me to go see a theatrical production he was working on. And all the guys were there performing these wonderful monologues. And after, there was a whole discussion. And I got up and said how great it was. And Shakoure approached me because I had said something about being a writer, and he was a writer. And we started chatting. And when I had to leave, he got my address from the guy who I had known. And we started a correspondence. And so we really got to know each other. And it was a long time before I understood why he was there. I just knew he was there for 25 to life. And we really had a 2-person writers group. So his family decided that they were going to do this 23 years is enough campaign and try to get clemency from Andrew Cuomo in 2013. And so I went ahead and thought, oh, I'll do a film. I'll put a film together, 23 Reasons Why 23 Years is Enough. And thought that I was making a 5-minute film. Of course, it's not a 5-minute film, because there's a whole lot of good reasons why he shouldn't have been overcharged and over-sentenced. The judge in the case, Edwin Torres, was known as the time machine because he gave people the maximum amount of time he could, again and again and again. The felony murder rule was something where if you were involved in a felony and someone dies, anyone dies, even if it's one of the people who are, committing the crime, everybody gets charged with murder. And so, it's a tough question when you find out what somebody is incarcerated for. And I had to think about, my own history and what mistakes I made when I was 18 years old. And I always thought I was a great drunk driver back when I was drinking, and that, so I could easily have killed somebody. It just so happens that I didn't. So when so the film, we did not win clemency from Cuomo at the time. He doesn't like to give clemency to people while they're serving their time. He doesn't like to give it to anybody anytime, but he has been giving it occasionally to people who have served long sentences, and then as a kind of a double jeopardy, they're put into the immigration system. Now, Shakoure did not. He had very, very, very good reason to believe, and I still believe, that he's a US citizen. His father was in the Air Force during the Vietnam War. When he was in basic training, he got sworn in as a citizen. His discharge papers, his DD 214, has a check mark, an X in the box of citizen. But they're not recognizing that. Shakoure had no idea. Some other people from that particular crime that Shakoure was involved in were deported, but Shakoure wasn't. So ICE has already made a decision somewhere along the line that he's a citizen, but now they are hiding that. Anyway, that's a long answer, where now the campaign is to try to get Cuomo to stop this double jeopardy of being incarcerated and being deported to a place he's never been before. And Meryl is going to talk about the whole campaign around that.
I'll just jump in before Meryl. Thank you, Deirdre, for explaining the criminal justice part. He was convicted, but you know, at New Sanctuary, we believe no one should be deported. Our core values are no judgment, do no harm, and respect for all. So there's no reason why, after serving his conviction, and that he should be punished again and expelled to a country that he's never been to before. Like she had mentioned before, Shakoure was born in Germany on an American military base and was brought to the US at 2 months old. So he's never been to, you know, this country where they're saying that he's a citizen of Haiti. He's not a Haitian citizen. He's American citizen. This is the country that he knows, he loves, he built community with. He created his own nonprofit organization to give back to the children that are the at-risk youth, something that he was at that age as well. He's gone to school. He's gotten his bachelor's. He's done everything that he possibly can to give back to the world. And now ICE sees that and they want to break him and send him to a country where he has no family. He doesn't know the language. He has nothing. So that's why we're fighting for him more than ever. And not to go into too much, but the government is hiding information as well that will prove that he's an American citizen. ICE went to pick him up at his house 10 years after he had already been released from prison. So it shows that the government knows that he's a citizen, which is why they didn't pick him up after he was released. Usually when you're served a conviction and you're not an American citizen, once you're released from prison, they'll transfer you right into ICE custody. So you're not released. So this is why we built that campaign to push Andrew Cuomo to grant him clemency. That's the quickest way that we'll be able to get Shakoure out of detention. But expecting that that he might not. But that's what we need. We need all you guys that are listening to us right now to get involved, to push Andrew Cuomo, to call, email, tweet, everything that you can to apply pressure so that we can bring him home for the holidays. And I'll pass that over to Meryl so she can talk about how to get involved.
I just want to check in though with the rest of the panel. Is that something you prefer I do now or towards the end of the call?
Let's do that towards the end, so then people will be able to just do it right when. Great, and then we'll put all the links there too as well. But I do want to turn it to Anna, since Anna, you were involved with, or you still are involved with the NSC, and I believe you co-founded the Students for Sanctuary. Is that correct? So tell us about that, why you did that, and what you do with that group.
So it all started because me and one of my close friends, Trisha, were just completely horrified at the way that the Trump administration was treating immigrants. And we found ourselves in a difficult position because we wanted to do something. And we were like, well, we're just like 19-year-old students. Like, what is there that we can do? We're not lawyers. We don't work in the government. Like, is there anything that can be done? And through researching to try to do something about this, we found the New Century Coalition and started volunteering with them. And we just found the whole organization to be amazing and loved everything that they were doing and working towards. So we started volunteering, and we eventually got in contact with some of the administration at NSC. and started just kind of trying to gather volunteer interest from our campus. At first, we just kind of wanted to get some more people to find out that NSC existed and to come down with us to their pro se clinic to volunteer. And so we started taking people that were interested to clinics. We then expanded to taking people to accompaniments as well. And eventually we ended up gathering a lot of interest. We now have a listserv with around 300 volunteers that we mobilize constantly. And yeah, we just ended up turning it into a club. And we now have our own satellite pro se legal clinic that we help NSC with. And we're also, we used to send people to accompaniments. Now we have a wonderful network with other universities. The latest one is Yale University that are also teaming up with us to volunteer with NSC. And I guess we want to get Shakoure. Yes, that's fine.
Yes, so Shakoure is actually now on the phone. So Deirdre, turning it over to you.
Okay, Shakoure, I'm going to put you up near the speaker. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's my honor to, be part of this session. I didn't get a whole lot of details on the aims of the discussion today, but nevertheless, I'm here. I'm glad to make a short appearance because it seems like I may have just only 10 minutes. But I'm glad to open any questions that you guys may have, any curiosities, or just to listen to some comments. So just let me know how you'd like to proceed.
Well, thank you for joining us. We actually we did have a few questions. We wanted to hear about what your experience with NSC has been, and if you feel comfortable sharing any part of your story and your journey and what you've been experiencing.
Okay, sure. So, as some of you might know, I was subject to a deportation warrant issued by ICE, and on July 6th of this summer, there were 8 ICE agents who came to my home and put me under arrest in complete and traumatic shock to me and my family. And they whisked me away to a detention center, quote unquote, which is actually a county jail in New Jersey, where I've been held for past 4.5 months.
Thank you. And since the aim of this panel is sort of to provide not only the history of like this is not new, this has been happening for a long time, but also what can the community do? So like in your opinion, like what would you want to see the community come together to do, not only for you, but like for everyone who's experiencing what you've been experiencing?
Oh, absolutely. So what I think is the real travesty here is where someone who has spent virtually their entire life in the U.S., not unlike DACA recipients, and because of a felony conviction, they are pretty much treated as if they had just crossed the border and somehow got involved in something that they were charged with, and they're simply put under removal proceedings. So the fact that they could have been here for 20, 30, 40 years raised a family, opened a business, and have been entrenched and rooted in American culture, American economy, their communities, means absolutely nothing. So, to make it legal, even preferable to uproot and excommunicate someone who's virtually an American from this country, particularly to a country that you've never been in, you've never lived in, you've never had any ties with, you have no legal status in my estimation, is absurd. And that's exactly what's happening with my case. I've never looked at myself as anything but American. And I've tried with every opportunity to make a productive, positive, and inspiring living, whether it be with my family or with my colleagues or with my team partners, or with my nonprofit. That's been my aim. As long as anyone who has known the type of work that I do can tell you. So it's really mind-boggling that the country that we have always known as a country of immigrants can turn around and say someone that has lived their entire lives here, except for a technical legal classification, and turn around and say, you're no longer wanted here, so we're detaining you pending your deportation.
Thank you so much for joining us today and answering our questions. I'm going to turn it over to Nara. And
he only has a few minutes to talk. So,
Oh.
and then he has to go. So maybe if anyone on the panel wanted to ask anything, like maybe like if NSC, like what do you do? And what do you do to help, and what is your relationship with each other, I guess?
I mean, just because Shakoure does have a short time, I would like to ask him to share what it's like right now in immigration detention. He's there during COVID, and I think it's important for people to understand what that means.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. I'd be glad to give some insight into that. Okay, so I think people have a misnomer with the term detention. I know that the administration and ICE and DHS used the term detention to signify, what type of confinement or how the person is being held, and it should be something different from being incarcerated in a prison or a jail, when there's absolutely no difference. I am in a county jail just as those who are picked up by the police, charged, arraigned, indicted, and a court, either gives them or does not give them bail. So, it's the same exact environment. It's just that right at this particular jail, I'm in what they call an ICE unit. But the units are identical. They're all cells, concrete and steel. You have limited recreation in a day room or recreation room that's just outfitted with tables and chairs, TV, and that's it. Besides the phones that we have access to from time to time. And that's pretty much your existence. It's not any different from what you would understand from the criminal justice system in terms of being held. So, like I was saying the other day in another conference, I wear an orange jumpsuit that says "Berkeley County Prisoner," and that's pretty much how I can describe what the environment and situation is.
We really appreciate your time, Shakoure, and thank you for sharing some very vital insight with us, and we look forward to continuing to hear from you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm honored to.
And we'll share links. And we'll share links to the campaign and your video as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for the sake of time, I am going to turn it over now to Nara. I have a few questions here that we've been getting from some social media questions as well. What can history, a historical perspective, contribute to our understanding of present-day challenges to immigration rights? Are historical arguments ever in tension with legal arguments?
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a panel from the history department. So like, what is the relationship then between history on the one hand and what we're hearing Shakoure talk about, and his experiences at this moment and all of these, critical policy issues that we've been talking about. And I think very often people study history and they don't, it's not well taught in a lot of schools. So we think that history is a bunch of facts of things that happened in the past, right? And it somehow has nothing to do with what's happening in the present. But I think that for me, the power of history is to denaturalize the present, which is to say that history helps us see that things that we take for granted haven't always been that way. Right? And when I say things that we take for granted, I mean structures and institutions and ways of thinking, right? Things that are second nature to us haven't always existed the way that they exist now, right? And I think, you can do no better than to speak about, the immigration enforcement structure to appreciate that point. So, ICE, which we think of, or DHS, which we think of as these gargantuan, abstract, omnipotent, implacable institutions, right? How can we ever change them? And then we look at, we don't have to go very far back in time to see, oh my God, they're actually really new. Immigration enforcement has been done in different ways over the course of the 20th century. Turns out ICE is, founded in 2003. That's like younger than probably students on this call. So, ICE is like a little annoying 17-year-old brother, right? So if we think about it in those terms, suddenly structures that seem implacable and immovable become less powerful. And so I think that that's one of the things that history helps us to do. It helps us also to think about not just institutions, but ways of thinking, right? The very distinction between legal and illegal immigration, which this administration has made, has so emphasized. As our colleague, Professor May Nye tells us, that's a relatively recent invention, right? So I think these are some of the ways that history helps us to understand the present. Is history ever in tension with legal arguments? I think sometimes it can be. Historians, myself included, love to argue that there is nothing new under the sun, right? That, and I have made, the argument about family separation, that this policy looks a hell of a lot like analogous, historical episodes of Native American child removal and other things. That's absolutely an argument I buy and have made myself. I do wonder sometimes if historians in making that argument unwittingly can naturalize certain policies and make them sound like, well, it's not that bad, or it's happened in the past, right? And therefore, somehow it becomes not so bad if it's happening in the present. So I worry sometimes that might be an unintended outcome of our arguments that there's nothing new under the sun. So for example, I've seen, the ACLU, when they make their arguments about family separation in court, one of the things they really like to drive home is that this is unprecedented. This is absolutely the worst policy that they've seen in 30 years of, practice. And that's a really powerful argument in the court to make, right? But it's one that's sort of in tension, I think, with the arguments that historians want to make, where we find, roots and resonances moving back in time. So there might be a tension there too.
You commented on, talking about history and teaching. There's a course that you teach called Seeking Asylum, in which students combine academic study of asylum issues with hands-on engagement with social justice and advocacy organizations. And I think that's really the heart of our panel today. Can you just describe what that course looks like, and also give us some concrete ideas for how to get involved in immigrant rights issues, like how you do that through academia?
Yeah, so I think that all of us are coming to this panel with the same message, which is that there are lots of different ways to get involved in these issues, and that you just sort of have to think about what your own interests or passions or skill sets are. Where are you in the world, and how can you do your part? And so for me, after Andres and somebody, I think Anna also made the comment that 2016 in the election of Trump was a really radicalizing experience for them, and I had the same experience myself. And for me, that moment consisted of students coming to me and saying, "What can I do? I want to do something. What do I do? I'm 19, I'm 18. Give me something to do." And so in the first instance, I gave them lists of organizations in New York City, among them NSC. Go volunteer, go offer your services. But the fact is that most immigrant rights organizations are incredibly strapped for time. They do not have the bandwidth to deal with young, energetic, but unskilled labor, right? Actually, NSC is probably the organization that does this the best. Like, they have a structure for doing this, but most organizations don't. And so it felt a little irresponsible to just sort of send students out willy-nilly into the city to go help. Like, what does that look like? What does that mean? Do you actually know what you're doing? Do you know anything about these topics? And so it was really that experience that inspired me to teach this class called Seeking Asylum, where we talk about the history and politics of the so-called asylum crisis on the US-Mexico border. And the class is distinguished by the fact that we partner with an advocacy or activist organization. And so that students are learning about these issues, but we're really figuring out how to put their knowledge and new skills to work for the organization, our partner organization. So it's really the partner organization that calls the shots and tells us what they need and how we can help them. So the first year I taught the course, we went down to the largest ICE detention facility in the country, in Dilley, Texas, and the students worked for a week as part of a pro bono legal project there. This past year, we collaborated with Kids in Need of Defense, which is an organization that works with unaccompanied minor migrants. And this coming semester, we'll work with Women's Refugee Commission on a storytelling project. So, the idea again is to sort of think about the relationship between academia and activism, and to think about the relationship of the classroom to the real world. And we often talk about those things as if they're binary and sort of, well, there's the classroom and then there's the real world, or there's the Ivy Tower and then there's, what real people are doing. And I really want to bring those things together and kind of deconstruct that way of thinking about their relationship, but to think how they can be, sort of mutually nourishing one another, you might say. So that's really the purpose of my class. And if there are any students on who are interested in the class next semester, I'll put my email in the chat momentarily, because I'd love to have you.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up question. I'm curious, Nara. When you did that, was that something that, I think it's very different in academia. Did you receive any backlash, or how was it accepted? Or was it accepted? Was it not accepted? Because oftentimes, as a student myself, you go to class and you learn, but then you sort of come home and you're like, I have all this information and I feel like frustrated. What can I do to help? But you're not only teaching, but you're also, tying in activism hand in hand. And how has that experience been for you as a professor?
Yeah, I mean, so isn't this, and I've had people ask me, wait, is this like blurring the line between activism and teaching? And, universities are supposed to be nonpartisan spaces. And my feeling about this is that I am not telling students what to think. I am putting at their disposal information and experiences, and then they decide how they're going to think about those things, right? These things are happening in the world. These organizations are existing. These processes are happening, and I'm putting them at you. I'm trying to make them available so that you can see what is going on. And I'm trying to put information at your, at your disposal, and have you read things in a world where, we never know if what we're reading is for real or not, right? But I'm not telling people what to think. They can have their own, opinions. There is no party line in this class, and people have different, sometimes different opinions about, different aspects of immigration policy, and that's fine. So it's not my duty to tell people what to think. It is my duty to put knowledge or information at their disposal and to encourage them to learn how to think critically about their world, which is, of course, what is so frustratingly missing sometimes from our public conversations in this country.
Absolutely. And something that my friends in grad school and I used to always talk about was that, as students who are studying history, we read about all of these atrocities and stories. But I think with you, not only teaching history, but also allowing your students that space to see it and experience it for themselves kind of makes it more real, right? And it makes it more human. So I really appreciate that. I want to turn it over to Emma. And
on that through line, we've been talking a bit about family separation and how that looks like many different things throughout time. And Ivón has written a lot of work about it. So I want to ask her, like so much of immigration history is conceived as adult-centric, and a lot of this abuse seems to be hidden or erased or hard to find, perhaps is the better way to put it. Could you please just speak about how America has been turning away or just treating children, maybe specifically who are seeking asylum?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think it's true that a lot of scholarly work about immigration in particular is overwhelmingly adult-centric, and yet there have been millions of children who have immigrated to the US for more than a century from diverse countries of origin in Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean. So contemporary surges of migrant minors are part of a much longer history of child migration to the US. Kids have certainly arrived as asylum seekers, as migrants, although if you have read any literature in critical refugee studies, you also know that the lines separating those categories are very, very blurry because young people, also adults who might be fleeing things like poverty, for example, that in and of itself is a structural form of violence, and yet those people are depicted as not being deserving of protections under humanitarian asylum or refugee policies. So I actually, I have an overview of child migrants in the 20th century that is supposed to come out next month with the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of American History. So if anybody wants a broad overview, once it's out, I can certainly share it. But in it, I write a lot about European and Asian child migrants in the first half of the 20th century who arrived at inspection stations in the New York Harbor and the San Francisco Bay. Even though some accompanied and unaccompanied European child migrants experienced detention and even family separation at Ellis Island, most were processed and admitted into the US fairly quickly in the early 20th century. Those children that were removed from the nation were removed for allegedly having immigrated for an immoral purpose, for having suffered from an illness or a disability, or being unaccompanied, because those were grounds for deportation under the Immigration Acts of 1907 and 1917. Chinese and Japanese child migrants were more frequently subjected to family separation, abuse, detention, and deportation at Angel Island. They were, particularly when it came to Chinese children, they were accused of presenting fraudulent claims to entry, which is not all that different from some of the accusations that are made against unaccompanied minors from Central America today, that they also are presenting fraudulent claims for entry. Some of these children were detained for weeks in detention, deported, separated from families. There's even evidence that some Chinese children in the first half of the 20th century in detention actually died from the life-threatening conditions that detention subjected them to. I'm sure that some people in the audience might also know about Mexican children during the Great Depression repatriation drives that were removed or coerced into voluntary departure alongside millions of adults. Some of these people were US citizens, some were undocumented. Around mid-century, European, Cuban, and Indo-Chinese refugee children were admitted into the US through a series of ad hoc programs and temporary legislation until the 1980 Refugee Act created a permanent mechanism for the admission of refugee and unaccompanied children. But anti-Semitism shaped the early admission of child refugees that were trying to flee Nazi Germany, for example. In 1939, Congress failed to enact a law that would have set aside visas for German Jewish children. And in 1940, and this sort of illustrates how racial and religious preferences can sometimes play a role in refugee admission politics, even when it comes to children. There were a series of air attacks on Great Britain, and the US supported efforts to admit over 1,000 British children into the US. Exclusionary immigration laws, the hardening of US international boundaries, and the US preference for refugees who fled communist regimes like those in Cuba or Indochina during the Cold War made unlawful entry the only option for thousands of accompanied and unaccompanied Mexican, Central American, Haitian children in the second half of the 20th century. Many of these children were also subjected to detention and deportation in the late 20th century. And it's in the 1970s that the US starts to systematically detain migrant minors, particularly unaccompanied minors. This happens in the post-1965 wave of unauthorized immigration from Mexico during the period where asylum seekers from Central America were fleeing state violence, child conscription, and US-backed civil wars, and a period in which there are large waves of refugees also from the Caribbean. It's also in this period that in my own research, I write about a moment of family separation that is, I think, perhaps the most analogous to the one that happened in 2017 and 2018 with the zero tolerance policy, in that immigration authorities separated families while they were trying to prosecute the human smugglers who transported them across the border. And in doing that, the human smugglers were really well resourced and they could pay for bond really quickly. But this actually resulted in the mass detention of thousands of children. And often their detention involved physical separation from their families inside detention centers that were not equipped to house children. Children were often lost to the federal bureaucracy. They were sent into foster care through a program that the US Marshals had contracted. Children were also deported alone into Mexico, where often they were recriminalized and put into juvenile detention facilities there. There were advocates at the time who claimed that family separation for some of these families was permanent, that children were permanently lost to their families. And the federal government was insistently lying and saying that they weren't separating families. Often they would contradict themselves and say that they weren't separating any children under 10, which of course indirectly confirmed the separation of older children. And yet there were human rights defenders, there were migrants inside detention centers who had organized hunger strikes, and journalists who were calling attention to the fact that infants, newborns were being detained, children were in fact being separated and lost. So just to speak to a lot of the themes that have been spoken on here, it's extremely important to listen to advocates, especially when government testimonies are unreliable, sometimes they're extremely deceptive, and that family separation, whether it be through deportation, whether it be in the history of violence against Indigenous families or Black enslavement, family separation is something that has happened in the past. It's happened to immigrant families, and the government has engaged in a lot of erasure. So it's like a broad overview, but I can certainly answer questions about any of the particularities or waves of immigrants.
I actually had a follow-up question about erasure, so it's perfect timing. Why is it so hard to find proof of abuse? For instance, we heard about the forced hysterectomies that were happening at an ICE detention center, but oftentimes we hear about things in the media and, you know, people are reposting and it's a hot topic, but then it sort of fizzles out and then it's hard to find any information about it. So can you talk about, you know, a pattern of abuse reported, patterns of erasure, hurried deportation of survivors, destroying files, you know, and again, I mentioned the forced hysterectomies that we heard about recently, but we don't really hear much about it afterwards. So can you speak on that a little bit, Ivón, and then Nara, and if anyone else would like to add to that? But Ivón, if you could answer first, please.
That is a really great question, and I'm sure that others will have some thoughts. So I'll try to just give a few points, which is that when I talked about, for example, the immigration of Haitians to South Florida, there were Haitian children, for example, who protested the abuse that they experienced while being incarcerated, the excessive disciplinary measures, the abuse, other rights deprivations to which they were subjected. They staged prayer demonstrations, hunger strikes, and one of the ways that the government retaliated against them was by subjecting them to deportation. In my own research on Mexican children who were expelled from schools in the 1970s and 80s, when they brought lawsuits against those practices, the federal government in those cases tried to initiate immigration raids in their communities to intimidate the kids and their families from bringing lawsuits that would expose systematic rights violations. I also have research about kids who were labor trafficked, and they too were retaliated against when they tried to bring lawsuits about their labor exploitation, about their debt peonage. So there is a history of deporting undocumented immigrants, even children, who speak out against rights violations. I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult to document, to expose patterns of abuse is historical. It's a result of mounting legal challenges that were waged against the immigration system that made it so that by 1924, immigration law had begun to diverge from constitutional norms, and the Bureau of Immigration had emerged as a really powerful organization that was free from the constraints that were imposed on other government agencies. So it was a lot of persistent litigation that contributed to the development of legal doctrines that gave immigration authorities a lot of power to fight against resistance from immigrants. One final reason that I'll add is just simply that in the case of incarcerated immigrants, immigrant detention centers can be so remote, they can be so geographically disparate, they can be so far from each other. And they also engage in the practice of habitually transferring ICE detainees who already have limited rights, like not being guaranteed an attorney. And I think that remoteness, that hiddenness of a lot of detention centers also facilitates a culture of impunity. It also enables a continued erasure.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And for I know we all can talk about this for so long. We were going to continue, but I just want to request that we keep it to about a minute each person, because we've never had a panel with this many people on it before, and we really want to make sure we keep it balanced, especially between like academia and activism. Like Nara was saying, it's an interesting relationship, so we want to make sure that we keep it in conversation with each other. But if anyone else can speak to that. Yeah, Meryl.
Well, I just wanted to share, because I get alerts, something that just came on my phone that really talks to what's happening like in this conversation. From AP, children detained at border facing COVID exposure. This is from 18 minutes ago. There's 65 immigrant children in South Texas, rural area that you were just like, referring to, Ivón. We know that children have been flown across the country during COVID. So this particular place where they are, there's lack of soap, hand sanitizer, no social distancing, or very limited. And they've been there for 3 days, and we're just hearing about it. So there's more to the story, but I thought, like, holy crap, excuse me, but here we are talking about, like, as you were speaking, this flashed on my screen, and this is the kind of thing that's happening to children that, sometimes it's a blip on the radar because people are overwhelmed with so many other things.
We also encourage, if you have questions for the panelists, if you're on the live streams, comment your questions in direct. Let's keep it more organized, so you can direct it to a specific professor or student or activist. So Anna, actually, we haven't heard from you in a bit, so I want to give you some more time. Can you talk about the court process, maybe? That seems to be an area where that there is conversation, but maybe not on the news all the time, about what that process is for people, and maybe how you as a student and activist have gotten involved in that.
Yeah, so I feel like one of the things that you realize once you start working with people that are in court proceedings is just how dehumanizing the entire process is. And that is something that you don't really think of as much when you haven't seen it firsthand. I feel like a lot of the process, both through like EOIR, which is the court system, and USCIS, is just designed to completely bring down the person, and just, you know, both through like cross-examination and like trying to say that like their stories are false, and through like things like ISAP, which, you know, put the ankle monitors on them, and just the whole system's designed to just completely dehumanize every single person that comes into it. And it's very heartbreaking to look at, especially in the case of children. You know, like through NSC, I've worked with a lot of children that came in unaccompanied. I've worked with children that were separated at the border from their parents. And it's very sad to see the ways in which all of this has affected them, because you realize as an adult that this is probably going to have long-term consequences. It's not just about being in a detention center and then coming out and everything's fine. These are things that are going to keep, you know, just affecting our communities for a long time, which is why I think it's very important that people are constantly getting involved, not only to see this and attest to the things that are happening, but, you know, just kind of like, how do the places that we inhabit also contribute to this? Like, look at what the companies that you are purchasing from are supporting. Look at what contracts your university has. One thing that we did as students here at Columbia was mobilize against the contract that Columbia had with CBP, where they were benefiting from detention. I think the contract was $150,000. And as students, you know, many students groups mobilized against this, and we got them to cancel the contract, which was amazing. But these are some of the things that like you can do through just like, I don't know, getting involved and just realizing that even though this all seems like it's so distant and like legal jargon and that you're not supposed to show up or see this, like just going on accompaniments helps people a lot to not feel scared and like feel like somebody's witnessing the injustices that are being done to them, and like being able to spread the word, and so that it's not just falling into the ears of the people that want to hear immigrants directly, but also, you know, it like permeates into like family conversations and just things like that, which I think is very important.
Thank you. Unless Deirdre, you wanted to say quick something?
I just want to say quickly that also I think if there's law students listening, going into immigration law is one of those things that maybe people don't think of, but I was talking to somebody who was very glad that he was in there because he was understanding how kind of illegitimate the immigration courts are, because they're not under the judicial branch of the US government, the three allegedly equal branches. They're under the executive branch, which means that they cannot be just independent. And more, we need more fight right from the very roots of this horrible system.
And we had a question for Nara. Someone submitted on YouTube Live, what is the role of immigration historians in the immigrant rights struggle?
That's a really great question. And I'm actually not a historian of immigration. Ivón is our historian of immigration on this panel, so I'd be interested to hear what she has to say. I actually want to flip the question and think about not just what historians can do for immigrant rights, but what immigrant rights can do for folks sitting in a university. And I want to give as one example, I mean, this is a small but critical thing, what Anna said about the contract from CBP. That we learned of that contract because a student in the organization, Students for Sanctuary, was chatting with someone at NSC who showed him how to look up grants on the Federal Registry of Grants, whatever the web page is. And it was there that they discovered this grant that we did not know that I don't think anybody, well, I'm sure some people at the university knew, but no one who was going to make us think about it knew until that moment. So there's a moment when, and somebody at NSC showed this student how to look this information up on the Federal Registry, and all of a sudden we had, you know, a major scandal on our hands of discovering that there was this contract. So I think that this teaching and learning goes both ways, right? Certainly, you know, academics have, you know, and I don't want to denigrate expertise, because we're in a moment where, where we have a political climate that denigrates expertise. So I don't want to do that. I want to own our expertise, but I also want to suggest that it goes both ways. And that's an example of where, thanks to NSC and thanks to Students for Sanctuary, we were able to identify, they were able to identify the contract, and then people could mobilize around it. And as a result, the university is a better place. We no longer have, a contract with Customs and Border Protection.
Yeah. Ivón, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I'll just add briefly that I think a lot of what has been said, I think, kind of answers the question a little bit indirectly, that historians can offer the immigrants' rights movement a perspective about longevity. Nara mentioned earlier, I think really eloquently, and I had thought about it in this terms, that history helps to denaturalize a precedent that can produce really powerful arguments that might be able to be actualized by people on the ground who are doing the grassroots advocacy. I saw, I think maybe some weeks ago, that there was conversation around CBP trying to destroy some of their documents that would have documented some abuse, probably. And I think that by investing in the work of immigration history, that also can essentially help explain why destroying documents is just simply not a good idea, and can help to further, if those documents were destroyed, I mean, we won't know what kind of abuse and rights violations have been perpetrated. But I also agree that it's an opportunity, or rather that we can learn from each other, that it's not just historians and academics that can offer something to the immigrants' rights movement. I think the immigrants' rights movement and grassroots organizers and immigrants themselves have a lot of insight to offer us as well.
Thank you. I'll say it, I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, yeah, thank you. That's actually a perfect setup for my following question. My first question is, what can people do to become more active and help make a difference? And I know that's a very general question, but Ivón, you mentioned something about hearing from real people who have actually experiences and are experiencing the ramifications of immigration laws, right? And the separation of families. I like to look at it as, how can people view this as, a humanistic approach? Oftentimes we hear about so many stories through social media as we're scrolling on our phones, and it sort of desensitizes us, right? So I guess I have two questions for all of our panelists is, how can people get more involved and make a difference? And how can we take a more humanistic approach to the atrocities that are occurring? Whoever wants to go first.
Oh, go ahead, Anna. You go first.
No, you can go. You can go.
I'll be really brief. I think personally, I can speak about getting involved with New Sanctuary, but outside of New Sanctuary, personally, I have corrected friends on the language that they use. For example, illegal is something that really irks me when I hear, because nobody's illegal. So I always correct people in correct, instead of saying illegal, undocumented. And then having that conversation, it's a tough conversation with your friends and your family members, especially coming from a Hispanic home. Watching Univision and Telemundo is not always the right, they won't get the right information. So correcting family members and friends is definitely one way to bring a human approach to that. And then I'll bring in New Sanctuary as getting involved. with the anti-detention team, I get phone calls from detention every day. So just hearing someone on the other line, you feel the anxiety, the pressure, the depression that they're falling into, and it makes you want to do as much as you can. And we don't always win, but knowing that we're giving someone that power to tell us their story, gives them power, and it gives the community power to advocate for themselves. Anna spoke about accompaniments, them not going alone. So empowering the community so that they're not depending on us, but they have the power to advocate for themselves. So I think that's what, to be short, that's what I would definitely bring up.
And Anna, before you, if you had anything to add to that, there was someone who asked, can we help at the local level, and how? And I think that's a great question, because it can sometimes feel lofty when someone just says, get involved. And it's like,
Yeah.
Where do I start?
So yeah, a way that, the way I started was really just finding an organization that was willing to take in volunteers. And then there's a lot of initiative you can take from there. Like for me, Anuja and Trisha, it meant creating a club to get other people mobilized to get out there. But I think it also means raising awareness, if you know lawyers, or if you're a lawyer doing like know your rights trainings, or just spreading information like this, going with pamphlets of know your rights and going to businesses and being like, hey, can we put this here? Like just raising awareness of things is very important in the local level. And if you don't find like a structure or institutions that are already doing this work, you can get involved and you can create some of this work, always informed by the people that this is affecting, by the way. I think that's very important, to first and foremost, like put the people that are being affected at the forefront of any movement or any type of involvement that you're going to get into. And then just moving on to like the humanization, I think something that's very important and that I see often in social media is the sharing of images that are very disturbing and personal and dehumanizing in turn, that people share just to like take part in the sensationalism. Like it happened with that father and his daughter that were crossing the river, as well as like the death of some of the children in detention. And I think, it is so important for me to always emphasize how wrong that is and how much people shouldn't be sharing those images, and just respect the privacy of these people, not as a sensational moment or a controversial point in time, but as people, and to respect that as well.
And I think if there are any historian people here who want to talk about, maybe like before we wrap up, like humanization in history, and maybe if like, I don't know if that's something that you've encountered in your work as you were studying, and when you're a student, like do you encounter work that you find really jarringly dehumanizing? And on the opposite end of that, how do you humanize history in your own work?
Maybe I would just say, I'm not sure if this is an answer to the question, but it seems to me there are multiple ways that people can get involved, and this is sort of going back to the question of how do you get involved? Like, if you're not a lawyer, you go, well, what can I do? Everything seems to happen in the courts, right? But in addition to the courts, there's also the court of public opinion, right? And so a number of the comments of Andres and Anna and others have made reference, I think, to the power of stories. And so I would like to make a plug for the importance of narratives and stories. And, one of the reasons we're in the moment we're in is that there are such odious and noxious stories and narratives circulating about migrants and immigrants. But they're not omnipotent. I mean, they can be replaced by something else. And so, I train my students in op-ed writing so that they can go into public and say something, learn something, and then say it, right? And say their narrative so that it's floating around there. But I don't think you need to write an op-ed to do that. I mean, I think probably there are brilliant 15-year-olds who, with a TikTok video meme, can change the way people think about things. So I want to make a plug for people thinking about the power of narrative and storytelling and the stories that we tell, and certainly people working, for example, at NSC with friends of in the organization, hear stories. And that's not to say they should go out and tell other people's stories, but I think that there are ethical and effective ways that, in respectful ways, that you can share, you can witness what you are seeing, right? As opposed to simply just sharing someone else's story, but you can share your story, right? Your experience of working with the friends, or what you witnessed about how ICE functions or whatever. And I think those are really, really important. It's actually kind of amazing how little people know about what goes on in immigrant detention centers and in immigration courts, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff to know about the world, so it's not anybody's fault. But I think that for people who might be interested in this, it's really incumbent on us to try and bring those stories out. And so I think it's, we got to hear Shakoure on this call. Like, that's kind of amazing. Now, somebody can go write a letter to their to the editor of their local paper and say, people in immigrant detention wear orange, jumpsuits, and here's what they're experiencing. So just one small example, but a plug for stories.
Yes, and I think that's a wonderful place to wrap up. And I really, I feel like you can check in the comments, actually, there are some action items. If Meryl wanted to, oh, right, Meryl, yes.
Yeah, just because this is so important. So I'm just going to be a nudge and say this. Because, people are asking, I got something super specific. They should do it the minute they get off this phone call, and it's really easy. Can I share my screen for like 2 minutes?
Yeah, I think you have that capability.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you all what, oh my God, my screen is so full.
And for those who might not know the phrase action item, that really is just sending an email to a representative, or it really can just be simple as that. And this is a good example of that.
Right. So there are 2 links. I'm just going to show you one just so you get the idea. And this is created by Empower Change, which is a group that's also on Shakoure's team. And you can see from the graphic, we've created a really strong coalition that is fighting for Shakoure. And that's one of the things that's really important. And any of you on this call can volunteer for probably any of these organizations, but we advocate for NSC. But this is a really incredible tool. It's basically click to email or click to call. So all you need to do, we've shared this in the comments, it's on Facebook, and I don't know how else you're sharing with people, is that you, what's that?
That's about it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll put it in again, but you fill out your information and literally you click, and it does this tool does all the work for you as far as emails go. And there's another one, I don't know if you can all see it, but it's click to call, and it takes you right to Cuomo's line, and it might send you through a few different channels to get there, but you'll get there. So it literally does all the work for you, and we're really imploring people to do this. Like Andreas and Deirdre said, we want Shakoure home with his family for the holidays, not in ICE detention or ICE jail. And the other thing, again, as I mentioned, you can sign on to join NSC via our website. That's also in the links. And I'm going to stop the screen share. And we are going to have a massive letter writing campaign for Maria, who I mentioned earlier. And we need people. We need people for things like that. So they're very simple things that you can do. You can do it for 5 minutes a day, and you will literally have made a difference in a human being's life. So
thank you so much. And thank you so much. And that just reminds us that these active calls that we've been taking, these have been happening throughout history. And it's only with the internet that now it's this easy. But I think it's really important to note that we are participating in history. It's not a thing of the past, and we can do something. And that's what this panel was aiming to portray. And I really appreciate you all being here. And I thank you to the department, our chair, Autumn Costo, and the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity for our department. And thank you all for joining us. We will have another panel hopefully next month. Or definitely next month. We just have to schedule it. But so keep your eye out for that date. And thank you all for attending. And do those action items right now when you hang up. Bye.
Thank you so much for your invitation.